Hi everyone, welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Elana Stein, Hain, and this week we're going to talk about the Korban Asham, the guilt offering. Guilt offering is a bit strange because you already have an offering that seems to be for expiating sins. It's called the Korban chatat, right? It is the sin offering. It gets you kapara, gets you atonement for sins where if you had done them on purpose, you would be chayevet or chayav karet, excision. And if you do them not on purpose, meaning in some unwitting or ignorant way, then you have to give this korban chatat. But what is the asham? And as we're going to see, the asham gives us a different dimension of sin, and it seems to be coming in response to six very random, unconnected, disconnected situations. But I think we're going to see that they are actually connected. So let's take a look, starting with our Mishnah that shows up on 54b, Nun Dalet Amud Bet in Zevachim. Elohein Ashamot, here are the Korbanot Asham. First, Asham Gezelot, you owe money, but you lie about it. Somebody says, you haven't paid your workers. Under oath, taken with God's name, you say, yes, I have, right? In court. And then we find out that was not true. Somebody says, you owe me money from a loan that I gave you. And you swear with God's name, no, I don't, but you're lying. Asham Gzelot, in addition to paying back the money. Asham Mi'ilot, if you misuse consecrated items. Something's been promised as a korban to the Beit HaMikdash, and instead of giving it as a korban, you use it for yourself. I don't know, you ride on it to work. Asham Shivcha Charufa, this strange in-between situation where a woman is half slave, half freed, and she is promised, her betrothal is promised to an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, and somebody else sleeps with her. Asham, Shivcha, Charufa. Charufa, we think, means designated, probably, because she's designated to marry someone else. Asham Nazir, the Asham that is given when somebody who is a Nazirah or a Nazir comes into contact with the dead, which breaks up their Nazirut. It's a problem. Asham Mitzorah, the Asham that someone gives after they finish their tzarat, their skin disease period, as they are in their Tara process, their purification process. And Asham Talui, the guilt offering, the just in case guilt offering, where you're not sure whether or not you did a sin that requires a korban chatat. Now, what do these six have in common? Why are they even a category? And what we're going to see is they actually do have something in common. So first things first, let's look at each one. Asham mi'ilot, right? And I'm going in order of the Torah. Asham mi'ilot shows up in Vayikra chapter 5. Asham mi'ilot, you misuse consecrated temple property. Nefesh ki tim'ol ma'al v'chat'a bishgaga mikodshei Hashem. If somebody is committing a trespass and unwittingly misused God's sacred things, vehevi et ashamo laHashem, they bring their asham to God. Ayil tamim min hatzon, it's going to be a ram that is unblemished from the flock. Be'erkecha kesef shkalim b'shekel hakodesh laasham. It has to be, now JPS, Jewish Publication Society, explains this as it has to be able to be converted into payment in silver by sanctuary weight. Now, Chazal, they interpret be'er kecha. It has to have the value of kesef shkalim. It has to have the value of at least 2 shekel. Meaning, there's something about the value of this item, okay? Korban chatat, we don't have that specification. It could be cheaper than that. And then it continues, fine. That's Asham Mi'ilot. Then we move on in the next psukim in the Torah, also in Perek Hay, to Asham Talui, the Asham that you give when you're not sure if maybe you did an Avera that requires a Korban Chatat. And by the way, we gave a shir on the Asham Talui a few weeks back, or not a few weeks back when we were learning Horiot. Look it up if you're interested in it. But notice, V'im nefesh ki techeta, ve'asta achat mikol mitzvot Hashem, asher lo te'asena, v'lo yada ve'ashem v'nasa avono. If a person sins and they did any of the mitzvot of God that they're not supposed to do, in other words, they transgressed a negative commandment and they didn't know, and they are ashem, they are guilty, they will carry their sin. And what are they going to do? Ve'vi ayil tamim min hatzon. They are going to bring, again, an unblemished ram from the flock. Again, this word be'er kecha. The English says, or the equivalent. That's how the JPS says it. Something about its erech, something about how much it costs. La'asham, as an asham, as a guilt offering. El hakohen, to the priest. V'chiper alav hakohen, al shigagato asher shagag, v'hu lo yada, v'nislach lo. Right? And the Kohen is going to get kapara, is going to get atonement for them over what they messed up on. Asham hu, ashom, asham laHashem. It's a guilt offering. They're guilty before God. Now, the way that Chazal understand this is not you did a sin and you didn't know that it was a sin. They actually say it's you might have done a sin and you're not sure if you did a sin. So that's the asham talui. It's if you find out that you actually did do a sin, then eventually you give a chatat. But in the meantime, you give an asham talui. Notice that word be'erkecha again. Something about the erech, something about the value of it, the monetary value. And then again, in the next psukim in the Torah, also Vayikra Parakeh, we learn about the asham gzelot. This asham where you lied under oath using God's name about owing someone money. Guess what? The word be'erkecha is going to show up again. Nefesh ki techeta u'ma'ala ma'al ba'Hashem, a person who sins and commits a trespass against God. Now, this is interesting. It uses that word mi'ilah, a trespass, like we had in Asham mi'ilot. A trespass against God, how so? B'chichesh ba'amito, b'fikadon, or b'tzumed yad, or b'gazel, או עושק, או עשק את עמיתו, או מצא אבידה וכיחש בה, ונשבע על שקר, על אחת מכל אשר יעשה האדם לחטוא והינה. It lists all these different ways that you might lie about owing money. It might be a picadon that somebody gave it to you, right? It might be something that you stole. It might be you didn't pay on time. All sorts of things, right? And then it goes on, it says you're going to have to return it. And then it also says, notice it said you took a shvua al sheker about one of these things. You lied under oath. So in what way did you trespass against God? What do you mean? You used God's name in vain to lie about these things. The last pasuk in this sequence, ve'et ashamo yavil Hashem, a person will bring their asham to God. Ayil tamim min hatzon, again, a ram, an unblemished ram. Be'erkecha, JPS says, or the equivalent, but something about its erech, something about its cost, its value. Lasham el kohen, as an asham to the kohen. And then it goes on, etc., etc. So this word erech, let's take note of it. And also let's take note of the idea that the concern here seems to be mi'ilah b'Hashem, right? Doing something that is a trespass against God. Now, there are three other instances in which you give an asham, and they are in different places in the Torah. Vayikra, Perek Yudalid, we talk about the Asham Mitzorah. And when we look at the Asham Mitzorah, remembering that we're talking about somebody who is going through a Tahara process, the Asham is described, and interestingly enough, the Mitzorah gives both an Asham and a chatat. But something that might surprise you is instead of giving an ayil this time, instead of giving a ram, the Mitzorah or Mitzorat gives a keves, gives instead of giving a ram, they give a lamb, right? So something a little bit different. By Yikra Yutet, we find out about this Asham Shivcha Charufa, somebody sleeping with a woman who is half free, half slave, who is promised to a Hebrew slave. And in that situation, we're back to the ayil, right? We're back to giving a ram. Erkacha is not there, by the way. And then you go to Bamidbar and you have the Asham Nazir. And the Asham Nazir, also Erkacha is not written there, but there too, actually, we are having as the Asham, not a ram, but a lamb. So there's something in common between the Asham Nazir and the Asham Mitzorah. And we also want to figure out what's in common between all six of these. Is there a category here that's trying to tell us something? So famously, the Ramban says, yeah, there is a category. Let's look at the word Asham, what it means. The Ramban says, I don't think Asham means guilt. I think Asham comes from a different word. Let's take a look in number 8. ולא נתברר מה הטעם יהיה שם הקורבן האחד חטאת ושם האחד אשם. Why do you need something called a chatat, a sin offering, and something called an asham, a guilt offering? וכולן יבואו על חטא. They're all offerings for doing something sinful. ולא נוכל לומר בעבור שהחטאת נקבה, and we can't say, oh, well, maybe chatat is called chatat because it's female. But Ki yesh chatat zachar. We actually have an example of a korban chatat that is male. Seirim uparim. Sometimes we'll give a seir lachatat. Sometimes we'll give a par lachatat. Those are male animals. Ve'ein lomar shehe mipnei chomer achet. And you also can't say it's because, well, maybe some of these sins, maybe the chatat sins are worse than the asham sins, or the asham sins are worse than the chatat sins. Ki yinei ha-metzora, because the example of the metzora, maybe shnei korbanot, he brings both, or she brings both. Shem ha'achad chatat, v'shem ha'sheni asham. One of them is a chatat, and one of them is asham. So if it's about what's the severity of the sin, it should be you either need a chatat or an asham, right? So here's what he thinks. V'nir ed einai, this is what I think he says. Ki shem asham, the term asham, more al davar gadol, asher ha'oso yitchayev liot shamim va'aved bo. The word asham is not guilt offering. The word asham is like the word shamim. The word asham is someone should be ruined by what they've done. Milashon ha'ashimim Elohim. He's about to bring us a bunch of psukim in Tanakh where ha'ashem or ashem, ye'ashamu actually means punished or ruined. By the way, the most interesting one of them, in my opinion, is when the brothers of Yosef say, Ashemim anachnu. He argues, Ashemim anachnu does not mean we are guilty for what we did to our brothers. It means we are currently being punished or ruined for what we did to our brother, right? Ne'enashim, they are getting punished. It says the Korban Asham is for things where a person should be ruined by them. On the other hand, the chatat, a korban chatat, more al davar nata bo min haderech. Somebody who is, when you give a chatat, it's for things where you've turned off the way. Milashon el ha-sa'ara velo yachati. From a pasuk in Shoftim, but the point is, lachati is to miss the mark. So meaning, asham are things that should ruin you, and chatat are things where you just miss the mark. And now he has to go through all of our six and help us understand why should you be ruined by these six. So he says, all right, well, let's take two at once, okay? Let's take Asham Gzelot, where you lied under oath with God's name about owing something. And let's take the Asham for Shivcha Charufa, where a woman was a half slave, half freed, and was supposed to be married to a Hebrew slave, and instead somebody else slept with her. Those two, you should be shamem, you should be ruined by them. Why? Ba'avur shehem ba'im al af al hamezid. Because those korbanot are not only given if you did it by accident, it's even if you did it on purpose. And therefore, yikarei korbanam asham. Their korban is called the asham because actually you should be ruined by this. But instead, we're letting you bring a korban. But this korban can't just be called you missed the mark. It wasn't an accident. You did it on purpose. Okay? What about asham nazir, right? Asham nazir, we would say the same thing. It's even if you purposely got yourself tamei lamet. So you're not going to say it's just missing the mark. You're going to say this is something that should ruin you. You did something it's not just very bad, it's qualitatively different. Aval, asham mi'ilot. What about asham mi'ilot, where you misused consecrated property? Well, that only applies when you're shogeg. So why are we calling it this intense asham, which means you should be ruined? Ba'avur shehu b'kodshei Hashem. Because what you did is you violated kodshim. you violated God's consecrated stuff. And therefore, it's a more intensive, there should be a more intensive punishment. Okay? So we've solved four so far for the Ramban. Then he gets to the Mitzorah, Asham Mitzorah. Why is that called an Asham? Because Shah Mitzorah Chashuv Kemet. Because somebody who gets tzarat, who gets that skin disease, is thought of by Chazal as somebody who is dead. V'inei kfar shamim va'aved. And that person is already shamim. So they give a Korban Asham. They've already been ruined, and they're giving a Korban Asham to recognize that they're coming out of that. Okay? Okay. And in fact, he continues and says, well, notice that the Mitzorah, the Mitzorat, gives both an Asham and a chatat. So he says, well, Bikare Korban Harishon Asham, the first Korban that he gives or she gives is an Asham, Sheyagen alav min ha'ashma asher hu shamem ba, so that it will protect that person from whatever the guilt is that they should be ruined by or they have been ruined by through their tzarat. And then, B'hasheni chatat, the next korban that they give is a chatat, shehu mechaper shegotav, because that will give them kapara, will give them atonement on anything they did wrong unwittingly. Okay? So far we got, let's see, we got Asham Zelo, we have Asham Shivcha Charufa, we have Asham Nazir, we have Asham Me'ilot, and we have Asham Mitzorah. Now the last one, what about Asham Talui? The Asham that you give when you're not sure if you did a chait, a sin that requires a korban chatat, if you're not sure whether you did that sin or not. Why do we call that an asham? Mipnei sheba'alav savur she'ein alav onesh. Because its owners think, well, there's probably no punishment for it. What's the big deal? I did it, I didn't, I'm not sure. I'm sure there's no punishment. Ki lo noda shechata, I'm not even sure if I sinned. Mipnei zeh, because of that attitude, hechmir alav hakatuv b'sfeiko yoder mivadao. Therefore, the Torah is more machmir, is stricter when it comes to you're not sure if you did the sin or not, because we don't want that cavalier attitude. Of course, there's an onish for it if you did it. You have to figure out if you did it. So basically, what you have here is the Ramban. It's not that he's connecting all six of these to each other, it's that he's figuring out how each of these six might deserve terminology of asham rather than chatat, because they're not just cases of missing the mark. They're cases where we want to express that either you should be ruined by them, or you have been ruined by them, or you should think about how serious they are, right? So that's one approach, right? That's the Ramban's approach. I also want to share with you Rabbi Yonatan Grossman's approach. Rabbi Yonatan Grossman wrote a book on Vayikra, Torah Korbanot, I think he calls it. It's a really great book. I think they're translating it into English. And I remember I was so fortunate to study with Rabbi Yonatan Grossman when we called him Ravioni when I was back in Migdal Oz, when I was just a kid, and really he was just a kid. And it's really remarkable to see what a master he is at reading Tanakh. It's really remarkable. So he says, I want you to look at the word Asham, and I don't want you to see the word guilt, and I don't want you to see the word shamim. I don't want you to see the word ruined or punished. I want you to see a different word. And that word you will see if you look in Shmuel Aleph, chapter 6. Vayihi Aron Hashem b'stei Plishtim b'shiv'a chodashim. The Aron was in the territory of the Plishtim for 7 months because they had nabbed it in a war against the Jews. Vayikru'u Plishtim l'kohanim elakosmim, and the Plishtim called to their priests and diviners, Lemor, to say, Manas el Aron Hashem, what should we do? Hodiunu b'met nishalchenu limkomo. How do we send it back to the Jews? Okay. Of course, they want to send it back to the Jews because they had been punished for keeping it. Vayomru im mishalchim et Aron Elokei Yisrael. So these diviners and priests said back to them, if you're going to send the Aron of the God of Israel, the Ark of the God of Israel, al tishalchu oto rekam. You should not be sending it empty-handed, so to speak. Ki hashev tashivu lo. You ready? You should you should return with it asham. Asham, a payment. an indemnity, some sort of compensation. As terafu, then you will be healed because they all got uh, a terrible plague, a hemorrhoidal plague. Vinodalachem lama lo tasur yado mikem, right? And, you know, if you don't uh, um, do this, then you're not going to be able to get rid of this plague that you have. Look at how the word Asham is used. The word Asham is used as compensation. Maybe Korban Asham means compensation. And that is exactly where Rabbi Dr. Yonatan Grossman goes. He says, you know what these all have in common? In some way, you're stealing from God. And the Korban Asham is about compensating for stealing from God. Let's take a look. He said, Yesod ha'erech ha'kaspi shel ha'behema. The foundational issue of the monetary value of the animal. Remember, we started with this word erkecha, erkecha, erkecha. And then Chazal explained that it has to be at least 2 shkalim. It has to be at least 2 slaim, ultimately, they explain it. Right? It has to be a certain erech. It has to be a certain value, monetary value. Milamed harbe alofio shel korban Hashem teaches us a lot about the character of the Asham offering. Hakashur mahutit lechet hami'ila v'hagzila. It is essentially connected to the sin of trespass, misappropriation, theft, ulahachzarat davar shenital lelo reshut, and returning something that was taken without permission. Me'achar shegam b'mikre gzelat hachaver, noting the fact that even in a situation where somebody lied under oath about having money of a fellow human being, HaTorah potachat umagdira zot mishum ma kemi'ilah Hashem. The Torah describes that also as mi'ilah b'Hashem, doing some sort of trespass or misappropriation vis-a-vis God. Remember, it said, nefesh ki techata, a one who sins, uma'ala ma'al b'Hashem, and did a trespass against God. That wasn't just about when you actually do mi'ilah and misuse consecrated items. It was also when you lie under oath about owing money to a friend or to a fellow, right? Nitan liot meduyakim yoter. We can be even more precise. V'hadavar yuchach, be'emshech, and it's going to be proven as we continue. Ha'asham mechaper al gazilat gavoha, al mi'ilah b'Hashem. The Korban Asham is there to atone for stealing from God, for some sort of trespass against God. Dafka behemat asham tzricha liot be'erech kaspi mesuyam. It's specifically the Korban Asham that has to have a certain monetary value, as opposed to the Korban Chatat. Ki Korban ze kashur b'talich shel hashava shel pitzui erech. Because this Korban, this sacrifice, is connected to a process of returning and compensating something monetarily stolen. I think this explains all 6 situations where you have to give an asham. I even think it can explain why, while in 4 of the 6, you have to give an ayil, a ram, in 2 of the 6, you only have to get, not only, you have to give a keves, you give a lamb, something different. Lifnei she nivchon zot, before we try to understand this, or we examine this, Birtzoni laha'ir shedavar ze kashur ulai gam b'lashon Asham. He says, and I think this is connected to the terminology of Asham itself. Kvar he'arti shezo milah rav mashma'it b'mikra. I've already explained that this word has many different meanings in scripture. V'achat ha'ora'ot shala hi hashavat pitzui kaspi. And one of its explanations is returning money in a compensatory way. Me'achar shebechelek mimikrei hasham, given that in some of the situations where you have to give a korban asham, litzad hakorban, aside from the sacrifice, yesh hashava shel davar ma shenilkach lelo heter, you actually have to return some money or some money that was taken without permission. Severe ligzor le'orakach gam et shema korban. It makes sense to actually call the korban's name hakorban hamuva im hashavat gezel, a sacrifice that is given alongside the returning of stolen money. Of course, it makes sense to call it asham. It makes sense to call it compensation. So let's go piece by piece. Here's his theory, and I think it's a really fascinating theory. Asham mi'ilot, the asham that you give for misusing divine, consecrated items for the mikdash, stealing from God. So not only do you have to pay back to the temple treasury plus a 25% tax on it, but you also have to give a korban that indicates some sort of repayment, a korban asham. This whole situation is a repayment, so to speak. What about asham talui? Asham talui, this is fascinating. The asham that you give if you're not sure if you did a sin that requires a sin offering, a chatat. Well, you don't want to steal from God. Maybe you'll never know. Maybe you really do require a korban chatat, but you just never know that you do. So what have you done now? You've stolen from God. You were supposed to give a korban chatat, but you didn't know. So therefore you give an asham talui. It too is a compensation. It's a just in case compensation. How about asham gzelot? Very simple. You used God's name in vain to steal money. You implicated God in your stealing. That is a manner of stealing from God. Compensatory korban. Asham mitzorah. And this is where it gets kind of fun. Asham mitzorah, for somebody who's going through the purification process because they had tzarat. What do you mean? You just spent a lot of time where you couldn't go to the mikdash. You stole time from God. As a mitzvah, you're outside the camp. You can't be involved in the mikdash. You stole time from God. You stole closeness to God, proximity in some way, and you have to repay it. Now he says, by the way, notice the Asham Mitzvah is one of those things where you don't give a ram, you give a lamb. He says because it's different than the other Ashamot. The other Ashamot, you actually stole something that has monetary value, right? Maybe it was a korban chatat that you should give. It was a certain amount of money. It was a consecrated item. It actually has, some value that you can name, right? That you can quantify. Here it doesn't, so the korban is different. Just to note that, but it's still a type of asham. Asham shivcha charufa. This is a really interesting case because shivcha charufa is a woman who is half free and half slave. I mean, lo aleinu, all of that, but it's a category, half free, half slave. If somebody was fully free and somebody slept with her and she was betrothed to somebody else, that would be a sin against the kiddusha of betrothal, right? If she was fully a Canaanite slave, again, lo aleinu, if she was fully a Canaanite slave and she was supposed to marry somebody and somebody slept with her, or supposed to marry or not supposed to marry, then again, I would say, like Rahman al it's a monetary issue. You just have to pay money. Here we're in this mezzo lane. Because on the one hand, she's still quote unquote owned by somebody. So money has to be paid. But on the other hand, she's half free. So you've actually you've stolen from the Kiddusha here and you have to compensate. It's not compensating her, master, or mistress. You're compensating God, Ki'ilu, for doing Me'ila, right? Doing some trespass in the Kedusha of betrothal. And then the Asham Nazir, clear, the Asham Nazir just stole days of Nazirut. They have to start again. They have to start again. And again, because we're talking about stealing time and not stealing something uh, monetarily quantifiable. Instead of being a ram, it's a lamb, so that you notice it differently. Now, I think this is brilliant. Is it a slam dunk? I think it's a slam dunk. I think what is a slam dunk about it is that I think all of these things are, if you think of it as trespass, all these things do have some element of trespassing on something sacred in some way. But what I think is really interesting about it is that what it's trying to do is it's trying to get you to think about the possibility that in one's religious or spiritual life, there are different types of infractions that do different things. And they do different things to a person spiritually, and they just do different things metaphysically. So one type of transgression is different than another type of transgression. And the idea of thinking about a korban as restitution for something that I like stole from God, as it were, is different than thinking about a korban that is me coming and saying, you know, I did the wrong thing, and therefore I'm bringing this almost as a prayer that you'll forgive me. Something like that. So if that's the case, I think it's actually really interesting because at the end of the day, that means that Korban Asham is actually much less about guilt and it's much more about compensation. And Korban chatat is maybe much more about guilt and more about kapara. But suffice to say, this is at least giving us a little bit more of a layering into what korbanot are doing. As always, thanks for learning with me. Speak to you next time.